Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the U.E. Meridian, watching the stars drift past the large windows. The ship had been traveling through deep space for 3 weeks now, mapping new trade routes for Earth's growing merchant fleet. It was quiet work, but important work. Jake had been doing this job for 8 years, and he liked the peace of it all. Lisa Harper sat at her communication station running routine checks on the long-range sensors. She was young for a communications officer, but she was good at her job. Lisa could speak 7 alien languages and understand 12 more. Her job was to listen for signals from other ships or alien civilizations that might want to talk. "Captain," Lisa said suddenly, her voice sharp with surprise. "I'm getting a signal. It's not human." Jake walked over to her station and looked at the display screen. Strange symbols were moving across it in patterns he had never seen before. The signal was strong, which meant whoever was sending it was either very close or using very powerful equipment. "Can you tell where it's coming from?" Jake asked. Lisa worked her controls for a moment. "It's coming from the Zephyrian sector. That's about 6 light years from here. The signal is being sent on multiple frequencies at the same time. Someone really wants this message to be heard." Jake knew about the Zephyrian sector. It was controlled by something called the Collective, a group of alien races that had been living together peacefully for thousands of years. Humans had only made contact with them twice before, and both times had been brief diplomatic meetings. The Collective was known for being polite but distant. They traded with humans sometimes, but they mostly kept to themselves. "Can you translate it?" Jake asked. Lisa put on her headphones and started working with her translation software. The computer had records of previous communications with the Collective races, so it could help turn their words into English. After 10 minutes, Lisa took off her headphones and looked up at Jake with worry in her eyes. "Captain, this is a formal distress call. They're asking for help from Earth. They say they're being attacked by something called the Devourers. According to this message, 4 of their worlds have already been destroyed." Jake felt a cold feeling in his stomach. The Collective had 12 member races living on dozens of worlds. If 4 worlds were already gone, that meant millions of beings were dead or missing. But what worried him more was that the Collective was asking humans for help. In all the years since first contact, they had never asked Earth for anything more than basic trade agreements. "Is there more to the message?" Jake asked. Lisa nodded and started reading from her screen. "The message is from someone called Ambassador Veltar. He says the Devourers are unlike anything they have ever fought before. Their weapons don't work against them, and their ships can't match their speed. He says they have heard stories about human military capabilities, and they want to request assistance from Earth's naval forces." Jake thought about this carefully. The Collective was much older than human civilization, and their technology was definitely more advanced in many ways. Their ships could travel faster than human ships, and their energy weapons were more powerful than anything Earth had built. If they couldn't fight these Devourers, then these enemies must be incredibly dangerous. "Send a reply," Jake said. "Tell them we received their message and that we're sending it directly to Earth Command. Tell them a human representative will contact them within 48 hours. Lisa started typing her response while Jake walked back to his command chair. He activated his personal communication system and opened a direct channel to Admiral Kate Sullivan at Earth Command. Kate was one of the smartest military leaders humans had ever produced, and she would know what to do about this situation. The communication screen flickered to life, and Admiral Sullivan's face appeared. She was sitting in her office on Earth, and it was clearly late at night there. Her gray hair was a little messy, and she looked tired, but her eyes were sharp and alert. "Jake," she said, "what's so important that you're calling me at 3 in the morning?" Jake explained everything about the message from the Collective. He told her about the Devourers and the destroyed worlds and the request for military help. As he spoke, he watched Admiral Sullivan's expression change from sleepy annoyance to serious concern. When he finished, Admiral Sullivan was quiet for a long moment. Then she leaned forward in her chair and spoke in a voice that Jake had heard her use only a few times before. It was the voice she used when she was making decisions that would affect the entire human race. "Jake, I want you to set course for Earth immediately. Bring that message directly to me, along with all the sensor data you have about the Zephyrian sector. I'm calling an emergency meeting of the Defense Council for tomorrow morning." The screen went dark, and Jake was alone with his thoughts. He had been hoping for a quiet mapping mission, but instead, he might have just delivered the message that would drag humanity into its first real interstellar war. He looked out at the stars again and wondered what kind of enemy could frighten the powerful collective enough to make them ask for help from the young human race. Colonel Ryan Davis stepped off the transport ship onto the landing platform of Harmony Prime, the capital world of the collective. The air smelled different here, cleaner somehow, and the buildings around him looked like they had been grown rather than built. Everything curved and flowed in organic patterns that made him think of flowers or seashells. It was beautiful, but it also made him feel like he was visiting a museum instead of a military. HEADQUARCER's Dr. Emma Clark walked beside him carrying her equipment cases. She was a xenopsychologist, which meant she studied how alien minds worked. Emma had volunteered for this mission because she wanted to understand why the collective had suddenly decided to ask humans for help after centuries of keeping their distance. Behind them came Lieutenant Ben Parker and 3 other military advisors. They were all carrying data tablets and recording equipment. Their job was to study collective military tactics and figure out how humans could help them fight the Devourers. Ambassador Veltar met them at the platform. He was a Zephyrian, which meant his body was made of living crystal that changed colors when he moved. Right now, his crystal surface was showing deep blue and purple patterns that Emma's research said meant worry and fear. When Zephyrians were happy, their crystals showed bright yellows and greens. "Welcome to Harmony Prime," Veltar said in careful English. "We are grateful that Earth has agreed to help us in our time of need." Ryan noticed that the ambassador's English was perfect, but he spoke slowly, like he was thinking about each word before saying it. Most collective races could speak human languages, but they rarely had reason to practice them. Veltar led them through the city toward the military command center. As they walked, Ryan saw that the streets were full of different alien species, all living together peacefully. There were tall, thin beings with feathers instead of hair, short, round creatures with 6 arms, and others that looked like walking trees with faces. Everyone they passed stopped to stare at the humans with curious eyes. "How many different races live here?" Emma asked. 12 member species call Harmony Prime home," Veltar replied. "We have been living together in peace for over 3,000 years. This is why the Devourer attacks are so difficult for us to understand. We have forgotten how to fight wars." That comment made Ryan pay closer attention. When Veltar said they had forgotten how to fight wars, he sounded like he meant it literally. The collective might actually have no idea how to conduct military operations beyond basic defense. The military command center was a massive, dome-shaped building made of the same organic-looking material as everything else on the planet. Inside, Ryan found himself in a circular room with holographic displays showing star maps and ship positions. Dozens of alien officers were working at control stations, but everything seemed very calm and organized. It looked more like a space traffic control center than a war room. Admiral Zixtha approached them. She was a Kalafi, which meant she looked somewhat like a large cat that walked on 2 legs. Her fur was gray with black stripes, and her ears were pointed like a cat's ears. She wore a uniform that looked ceremonial rather than practical. "Colonel Davis," she said in a voice that sounded like purring, "we are honored by your presence. Please tell us how human military forces can assist us against the Devourers." Ryan looked around the command center and realized he needed to ask some basic questions before he could give any advice. "Admiral, can you show me your current battle plans?" Admiral Zixta activated a holographic display that showed the positions of collective fleets throughout their territory. Ryan studied the formation and felt his heart sink. The collective ships were arranged in perfect geometric patterns that looked impressive, but made no tactical sense at all. "What is the purpose of this formation?" Ryan asked. "It is the traditional defensive array," Admiral Zixta replied proudly. "Each ship maintains equal distance from its neighbors, and all weapons face outward to provide maximum coverage of the protected area." Ben Parker leaned over to Ryan and whispered, "Sir, that formation would be useless against any enemy that attacked from multiple directions. All their ships would be sitting ducks." Ryan nodded and asked his next question. "Admiral, what weapons do your ships carry?" "Our vessels are equipped with plasma disruptors and energy dampening fields," Admiral Zixta explained. "The plasma disruptors can disable enemy engines and weapons without destroying the ship itself. The dampening fields can absorb incoming fire and redirect it harmlessly into space." "What about projectile weapons?" Ryan asked. "Kinetic kill vehicles? Nuclear missiles?" Admiral Zixta looked confused. "Why would we want to destroy enemy ships completely? Our goal is to disable them so that conflicts can be resolved through negotiation." Emma stepped forward and asked, "Admiral, in your previous conflicts, what happened after you disabled enemy ships?" "The enemy would signal their surrender, and we would begin peace talks," Admiral Zixta replied. "This is how civilized species resolve their differences." Ryan felt like he was beginning to understand the problem. The collective had never fought an enemy that refused to surrender. They had no concept of total warfare or enemies who fought to the death. Their entire military philosophy was based on the idea that all conflicts could be resolved through reason and diplomacy. "Admiral," Ryan said carefully, "can you tell me about the Devourers? What do they want?" Admiral Zixta's ears flattened against her head, which Emma's research said was a sign of fear in Calathi. "The Devourers do not communicate. They do not respond to peace offerings. They simply arrive at a world and begin consuming everything. Their ships eat our ships. When our plasma disruptors hit them, they absorb the energy and become stronger." "Have you tried kinetic weapons?" Ben asked. "Physical projectiles that hit with mass and velocity?" "We do not build such crude weapons," Admiral Zixta replied. "Physical impacts can cause permanent damage to both ships and crew members." Ryan exchanged glances with his team. The situation was worse than they had thought. The collective wasn't just losing because the Devourers were stronger. They were losing because they literally couldn't imagine fighting a war the way humans understood warfare. "Admiral," Ryan said, "I need to send a report to Earth Command. Based on what I've learned here, this conflict is going to require a complete change in your military approach. Are you prepared for that?" Admiral Zixta looked at Ambassador Veltar, who had been listening quietly to the conversation. The crystal being's surface shifted through several colors before settling on a worried purple. "Colonel Davis," Veltar said slowly, "we asked for human assistance because we heard that your species has unusual problem-solving abilities. We are prepared to consider new approaches if they will save our people." Ryan nodded, but he was already wondering if the collective would still feel that way once they saw what human problem-solving actually looked like in a military context. Commander Alex Thompson watched as his engineering team worked on the collective warship, Peaceful Dawn, in the orbital shipyard above Harmony Prime. The alien vessel was beautiful, with its curved hull and glowing energy conduits but it was also completely wrong for the kind of war they were about to fight. Alex had been tasked with retrofitting collective ships to use human weapons, and the job was harder than anyone had expected. "Commander," called Sergeant Lisa Morris from inside the ship's weapon bay, "we've got another problem with the railgun installation." Alex floated through the zero-gravity workspace to where Lisa was working on a massive kinetic cannon. The weapon looked crude and ugly compared to the elegant collective plasma systems, but it could punch through Devourer armor in ways that energy weapons could not. "What's the issue?" Alex asked. "The ship's power systems aren't designed for the energy spikes that railguns create," Lisa explained. "Every time we test fire, it overloads 3 different circuits. The alien engineers say we're being too rough with their equipment." Alex sighed and activated his communication device to call Captain Morrison on the UES Meridian. Jake's ship was serving as the human command vessel for the retrofit operation, and he needed to know about every delay. "Jake, we're having integration problems again," Alex reported. "The collective ships are built for efficiency and elegance, but not for the kind of power loads that human weapons require." Jake's voice came through the communicator, sounding tired. "How long until the first retrofitted ships are ready?" "At this rate, maybe 2 weeks," Alex replied. "But I'm not sure the collective crews will be able to operate them effectively. They keep asking us why we need weapons that cause so much permanent damage." Meanwhile, on the surface of Harmony Prime, Colonel Ryan Davis was conducting training exercises with collective military officers. The sessions were not going well. Admiral Zixta and her staff were trying to learn human battle tactics, but they seemed physically uncomfortable with the concepts involved. "Admiral," Ryan said patiently, "in this scenario, the enemy has superior numbers and firepower. The only way to win is to use deception and misdirection to force them to divide their forces. But that would require us to lie to them about our intentions," Admiral Zixta replied. "How can we build trust for future negotiations if we begin with deception?" Dr. Emma Clark took notes on her tablet as she observed the training session. The cultural gap between humans and the collective was even wider than she had initially thought. The aliens weren't just unfamiliar with aggressive tactics. They seemed to find the entire concept morally disturbing. "Admiral," Ryan continued, "what if we told you that you could save 1,000 lives by sacrificing 10 ships in a diversionary attack? Would that be acceptable?" Admiral Zixta's ears flattened against her head. "Colonel, no military commander should have the right to decide which of his people will die. That decision belongs to the individuals themselves." Lieutenant Ben Parker was working on a different aspect of the problem. He had been assigned to develop intelligence-gathering methods that could give the collective advance warning of Devourer attacks. Ben had discovered that the aliens had excellent sensor technology, but they used it only for passive observation. The idea of using sensors for military surveillance was foreign to them. "Ambassador Valtar," Ben said during one of their planning meetings, "your long-range sensors can detect Devourer ships from several light years away. Why aren't you using this capability to track enemy movements?" Valtar's crystal surface showed uncomfortable orange patterns. "Lieutenant Parker, it would be inappropriate to monitor other species without their permission. Such surveillance violates the privacy principles that our society is built upon." "But the Devourers are trying to kill you," Ben pointed out. "Doesn't that change the situation? The fact that we are at war does not give us the right to abandon our moral principles," Valtar replied. "If we become like our enemies, then what are we fighting to preserve?" The first real test of human collective cooperation came when sensors detected a small Devourer force approaching the outer system of Kepler's Garden, a farming world with 2 million collective citizens. The retrofitted ship Peaceful Dawn was the only human-equipped vessel ready for combat, and Admiral Zixta insisted on commanding it personally. "Captain, Morrison joined the mission aboard the Peaceful Dawn to observe how collective crews would handle human weapons in actual combat. As they approached the Devourer ships, Jake could see that Admiral Zixta was nervous about what they were about to do. "Admiral," Jake said, "remember that the goal is to destroy the enemy ships before they can reach the planet. Don't hesitate. When the moment comes..." The Devourers appeared on the main display as dark shapes that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Their ships looked organic, like they had been grown rather than built. Long tentacle-like appendages extended from their hulls, and Jake could see smaller shapes moving around inside the larger vessels. "They're beautiful in a horrible way," Admiral Zixta said quietly. "It's hard to believe that something so elegant could be so destructive." The battle began when the Devourer ships launched what looked like living missiles toward the Peaceful Dawn. Admiral Zixta ordered her crew to return fire with their new rail guns, and Jake watched as solid projectiles tore through the enemy formation. The kinetic rounds punched through Devourer armor like it was paper, and the alien ships began to break apart. But instead of looking pleased with their success, the collective crew seemed horrified by what they had done. Jake could hear several of them making distressed sounds as they watched the enemy ships die. One young Kalathi officer actually left his station and ran to the bathroom to be sick. "Admiral," Jake said, "your people need to understand that this is what victory looks like against enemies like the Devourers." Admiral Zixta stared at the main display where debris from the destroyed ships was floating in space. "Colonel Davis warned us that human warfare would be different from our traditions, but I did not expect it to feel so final." A battle was over in less than 20 minutes. The Devourers were completely destroyed, and the planet Kepler's Garden was safe. But as Jake looked around the bridge of the Peaceful Dawn, he realized that the collective crew was more traumatized by their victory than they would have been by defeat. "Admiral," Jake said carefully, "how do you feel about what just happened?" "Admiral." Zixta was quiet for a long moment before answering. "Captain Morrison, we asked for your help because we were desperate and we had no other choice. But I am beginning to understand that there may be costs to human assistance that we did not anticipate." Jake nodded and made a note to include Admiral Zixta's concerns in his next report to Earth Command. The retrofit program was working from a technical standpoint, but the psychological impact on collective forces was something that no one had planned for. Lieutenant Ben Parker sat in his intelligence lab aboard the captured Devourer bioship, studying the organic computers that controlled the vessel's systems. The ship had been disabled during the battle at Kepler's Garden, and Ben had convinced Admiral Zixta to let him examine it before destroying the wreckage. What he found inside changed everything about how humans understood their enemy. "Dr. Clark," Ben called to Emma, who was working at the next station. "You need to see this." Emma floated over in the zero-gravity environment and looked at Ben's display screen. The image showed what looked like a neural network made of living tissue. Electrical impulses were moving through it in complex patterns that reminded Emma of brain activity. "The entire ship is alive," Ben explained. "It's not just made of biological materials. It actually thinks and feels. And look at this." He pointed to another screen that showed radio signals coming from the ship. "It's trying to communicate with other Devourer vessels, even though it's been captured." Emma studied the data with growing excitement. "Ben, if these ships are alive and they communicate with each other, then they might have something like a collective consciousness." "A hive mind. That's what I was thinking," Ben replied. "And if that's true, then maybe we can turn that against them." Dr. Maya Torres arrived at the lab 2 hours later. She was a bioweapon specialist who had been sent from Earth specifically to study Devourer biology. Maya was a small woman with short black hair and intense green eyes that seemed to see everything at once. "Show me what you've found," Maya said without bothering with greetings. Ben and Emma spent the next hour explaining their discoveries about devourer ship biology and communication systems. Maya listened carefully and asked detailed questions about everything from the neural network structure to the chemical composition of the organic computers. "This is perfect," Maya said when they finished. "If these ships really do share a collective consciousness, then we can design a virus that attacks their communication system directly." "What kind of virus?" Emma asked. "A cognitive virus," Maya replied with a smile that made Emma feel uncomfortable. "Something that would spread through their communication network and cause confusion, disorientation, maybe even madness. Imagine if we could make an entire devourer fleet forget how to operate their own ships." The idea was brilliant and terrifying at the same time. Emma had studied psychological warfare theory, but she had never imagined using it against a species with a hive mind. The possibilities were almost unlimited, and that was exactly what worried her. General Peter Hayes arrived at Harmony Prime 3 days later with a full human expeditionary force. He was a tall man with gray hair and cold blue eyes who had earned his reputation fighting in the Mars colonial wars. Peter brought with him weapons that most collective species had never heard of, and some that they couldn't even pronounce. Ambassador Veltar met with General Hayes in the diplomatic chambers of the Collective Council building. The meeting was supposed to be a formal welcome ceremony, but it quickly became something more serious when Peter started explaining what Earth was prepared to contribute to the war effort. "General Hayes," Veltar said, his crystal surface showing nervous yellow patterns, "some of these weapons you describe sound incredibly destructive. Are they really necessary?" Peter looked at the alien ambassador with the expression of someone explaining something obvious to a child. "Ambassador, the Devourers have already destroyed 4 of your worlds. They're not going to stop because you ask them nicely. Sometimes you need overwhelming force to solve a problem permanently. But what about civilian populations on worlds that the Devourers might be using as bases?" Veltar asked. "What about them?" Peter replied. "The Devourers don't take prisoners, and they don't leave survivors. Any world they've occupied is already dead." The conversation continued for 2 hours, and by the end of it, Veltar looked like he was beginning to regret asking for human assistance. The weapons General Hayes described included planet crackers that could shatter entire worlds, star killers that could make suns go supernova, and something called a reality bomb that could erase matter from existence. "These weapons," Veltar said slowly, "they could destroy entire star systems." "That's the point," Peter replied. "When you're fighting for survival, you use whatever tools are necessary to win." Meanwhile, Maya Torres was putting the finishing touches on her cognitive virus project. She had designed a program that would spread through devourer communication networks and cause their hive mind to turn against itself. The virus would make individual ships believe that other ships in their fleet were enemies that needed to be destroyed. "It's elegant in its simplicity," Maya explained to Colonel Davis during a briefing. "The virus doesn't actually damage their ship systems. Instead, it corrupts the data they use to identify friend from foe. They'll tear themselves apart and never understand why." Ryan looked at the technical specifications on his tablet and felt a mixture of admiration and horror. The weapon was incredibly clever, but it was also the kind of thing that could drive an entire species insane. "Maya, what happens to the Devourers after we use this? I mean, to the ones who survive?" "Survive?" Maya looked confused by the question. "Ryan, the whole point is that none of them survive. Once we introduce the virus into their communication network, it will spread to every devourer ship in the galaxy. Their entire species will destroy itself within a matter of days." "You're talking about genocide," Ryan said quietly. "I'm talking about winning," Maya replied. "The Devourers made their choice when they decided to become a species of planet killers. We're just giving them the logical conclusion of that choice. The test of Maya's virus came when sensors detected a large devourer fleet approaching the Nexus system where several important collective worlds were located. General Hayes decided to use the enemy fleet as a test case for the new weapon system. Lieutenant Ben Parker was assigned to deploy the virus using a modified probe that would get close enough to a devourer ship to inject the malicious code into their communication system. The mission required him to pilot a small stealth craft through enemy lines and make direct contact with a hostile vessel. Remember, Maya told Ben before he left, you only need to infect one ship. The virus will spread to the rest of their fleet automatically through their communication links. Ben's mission was successful. He managed to get close to a devourer scout ship and inject Maya's virus into its systems before escaping back to the human fleet. Within hours, the results were visible on long-range sensors. The devourer fleet began attacking itself. Ships that had been flying in perfect formation suddenly turned their weapons on their neighbors. The organic vessels tore each other apart with a savagery that shocked even the human observers. In less than 6 hours, an entire enemy fleet had been reduced to drifting wreckage. Admiral Zixta watched the destruction from the bridge of her flagship, and her ears were flat against her head in an expression of pure horror. Captain Morrison, she said to Jake, who was observing the battle, what have we become? What have you turned us into? Jake didn't have a good answer for that question. He looked at the debris field where hundreds of devourer ships had once been, and realized that the collective was beginning to understand what kind of species they had invited to help them win their war. The final battle began when every remaining devourer ship in the galaxy converged on the Nexus system, the heart of collective space. Long-range sensors detected over 3,000 enemy vessels approaching from multiple directions in what appeared to be a coordinated assault designed to overwhelm all defensive positions. Simultaneously, Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the U.E.S. Meridian, watching the tactical display with General Peter Hayes and Admiral Zixta. The combined human collective fleet numbered only 800 ships, but Jake felt confident about their chances. The humans had spent the last month teaching their alien allies how to fight like humans, and the results were about to be tested on the largest scale possible. Admiral, General Hayes said to Zixta, remember that the goal is total destruction of enemy forces. No prisoners, no negotiations, no mercy. The devourers don't understand anything else. Admiral Zixta's ears twitched nervously, but she nodded her agreement. Over the past few weeks, she had watched human weapons and tactics eliminate devourer forces with ruthless efficiency, and she was beginning to understand that her old military philosophy had no place in this kind of war. Dr. Maya Torres was aboard the science vessel Deep Explorer, working on her latest project. She had discovered that the devourer queenships, the massive vessels that controlled entire fleets, were vulnerable to a modified version of her cognitive virus. This new weapon wouldn't just confuse individual ships. It would shut down the entire command structure of the enemy fleet. Colonel Davis, Maya reported over the communication system, I'm ready to deploy the Omega virus as soon as we identify the queen ships in the enemy formation. Ryan Davis was aboard the assault cruiser Lightning Strike, preparing for what would probably be the most dangerous mission of his military career. His job was to lead a strike team directly into the heart of the enemy fleet and deliver Maya's virus to the primary queen ship. It was essentially a suicide mission, but Ryan had volunteered because he understood how important it was to end this war quickly. The battle began when the Devourer fleet entered the outer edge of the Nexus system. The enemy ships moved in perfect coordination like a school of fish or a flock of birds. Their organic hulls rippled with bioluminescent patterns that were beautiful and terrifying at the same time. General Hayes had arranged the human collective fleet in a formation that looked chaotic compared to the elegant enemy approach. Ships were scattered throughout the system in seemingly random positions, but Jake knew that Peter had planned every detail carefully. When the general gave the signal, the scattered fleet would converge on the enemy from 6 different directions. Simultaneously, all ships, General Hayes announced over the fleet communication system, execute maneuver Broken Arrow on my mark. Jake watched as hundreds of ships suddenly changed course and began moving toward predetermined intercept points. The collective crews had practiced this maneuver dozens of times, but they still seemed amazed by the complexity of coordinating so many vessels in such an intricate pattern. The first phase of the battle was a series of hit-and-run attacks designed to confuse the enemy and force them to divide their attention. Human fighters darted through the Devourer formation, launching kinetic missiles and then disappearing before the enemy could respond. Meanwhile, collective vessels used their superior energy weapons to target specific systems on enemy ships. Lieutenant Ben Parker was piloting one of the human fighters, and his job was to create confusion by attacking the Devourer communication relays. Every time he destroyed one of the organic antenna arrays, it disrupted the coordination between enemy ships and made them more vulnerable to follow-up attacks. "This is incredible," Ben reported over his radio. "The Devourers are so dependent on their hive mind that they can barely function as individual units. Every communication relay we destroy makes them weaker." The second phase of the battle began. When Colonel Davis led his strike team toward the center of the enemy formation where the Queen ships were located. The massive Devourer command vessels were over 5 miles long and bristled with weapons that could destroy entire ships with single shots. Ryan's team used a combination of stealth technology and pure speed to penetrate the enemy defenses. There, small ships were almost invisible to Devourer sensors, and they were able to get within a few hundred meters of the primary Queen ship before being detected. "Maya," Ryan called over his communication system, "I'm in position to deploy the Omega. Virus, are you sure this will work?" "Trust me," Maya replied from her laboratory on the Deep Explorer. "Once that virus enters their command network, every Devourer ship in the galaxy will lose the ability to distinguish between friend and enemy. They'll tear themselves apart within hours." Ryan activated the deployment system and watched as a small probe detached from his ship and flew directly into an organic port on the Queen ship's hull. The probe burrowed through the living tissue until it reached the central nervous system of the massive vessel and then released Maya's viral program into the Devourer command network. The effect was immediate and horrifying. The Queen ship began convulsing like a living creature in pain, and the bioluminescent patterns on its hull shifted from organized communication signals to chaotic flashing. Within minutes, the same effect began spreading to other ships in the fleet as the virus propagated through their communication links. Jake watched from the Meridian as the Devourer fleet began attacking itself with mindless fury. Ships that had been flying in perfect formation suddenly turned their weapons on their nearest neighbors. The organic vessels tore each other apart with their own claws and energy weapons while their crews went insane from the viral infection. "Admiral Zixta," Jake said to the collective commander, "I think you should see this." Admiral Zixta looked at the tactical display, and her ears flattened completely against her head. "Captain Morrison, those ships are screaming. I can hear them on our communication channels. They're in agony." Jake listened to his own communication system and realized that the Admiral was right. The Devourer ships were broadcasting what sounded like cries of pain and terror as Maya's virus drove their collective consciousness insane. It was the sound of an entire species dying in confusion and fear. The battle lasted for 18 hours, but the outcome was never in doubt after the first few minutes. Maya's Omega virus spread through the entire Devourer fleet, turning them against each other until nothing remained except drifting wreckage and the occasional survivor ship that had lost all contact with the hive mind. General Hayes stood on the bridge of his flagship surveying the aftermath of the battle with satisfaction. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced to the combined fleet, "the Devourer threat has been permanently eliminated. Every ship in their fleet has been destroyed, and their home worlds have been sterilized by our long-range weapons." But as Jake looked around the bridge of the Meridian, he noticed that none of the collective officers seemed happy about their victory. Admiral Zixta was staring at the debris field with an expression of horror, and Ambassador Veltar's crystal surface was showing colors that Emma Clark had told him represented grief and shame. "Admiral," Jake said quietly to Zixta, "your people are safe now. The Devourers can never threaten the collective again." Admiral Zixta turned to look at him, and her cat-like eyes were filled with something that looked like fear. "Captain Morrison, we asked you to help us fight our enemies. We never asked you to teach us how to become monsters." 3 weeks after the final battle, Ambassador Veltar requested a private meeting with Admiral Kate Sullivan aboard the UES Meridian. The crystal being's surface showed deep purple and black patterns that Dr. Emma Clark had learned to recognize as expressions of profound sadness and fear. The victory celebration was over, and now it was time to discuss what would happen next. Admiral Sullivan sat across from Veltar in the ship's conference room, looking as calm and professional as always. Her gray hair was perfectly neat, and her blue uniform was pressed and spotless. She had the appearance of someone who had just completed a routine training exercise rather than someone who had orchestrated the complete extinction of an entire species. "Ambassador," Kate said in a friendly voice, "I hope you're satisfied with the results of our cooperation. The Devourer threat has been eliminated permanently, and your people are safe." Veltar's crystal surface shifted through several color patterns before settling on a worried orange tone. "Admiral Sullivan, we are grateful for Earth's assistance, but we need to discuss the terms of your continued presence in our territory." Kate smiled in a way that didn't reach her eyes. "What terms would those be, Ambassador? We came here to help you, and we've accomplished that mission. The human fleet is preparing to return to Earth. But your construction ships are building permanent bases throughout our space," Veltar pointed out. "Your intelligence officers are installing monitoring equipment on our planets. Your military advisors are reorganizing our defense forces according to human standards. All of that is for your own protection," Kate replied calmly. "The galaxy is a dangerous place, and the collective has proven that it can't defend itself without human assistance. We're simply making sure that you'll be ready if another threat emerges." Captain Jake Morrison was listening to the conversation from his position near the conference room door, and he felt uncomfortable with the direction it was taking. Over the past few weeks, he had watched his own people systematically take control of every important military and strategic asset in collective space. The aliens had been told it was all temporary, but Jake was beginning to suspect that Admiral Sullivan had different plans. Dr. Emma Clark was taking notes on her tablet as she observed the interaction between the two leaders. Her psychological analysis of the situation was deeply troubling. The humans were displaying all the classic behaviors of a conquering force, while maintaining the fiction that they were only trying to help their allies. "Admiral," Veltar said carefully, "some members of the Collective Council are concerned about the long-term implications of human military presence in our territory. We appreciate your help, but we would prefer to manage our own defense going forward." Kate's expression didn't change, but Jake noticed that her hands were now folded tightly in her lap. "Ambassador, I understand your concerns, but you need to consider the reality of your situation. The collective military was completely unable to defend itself against the Devourers. What makes you think you could handle the next threat that comes along?" "We have learned much from working with human forces," Veltar replied. "Our people now understand the principles of effective warfare, and we can apply those lessons ourselves. Do they? Kate asked with a slight smile. Because from what I've observed, most collective officers are still traumatized by the methods we used to win this war. Admiral Zixta required psychological counseling after watching our weapons in action. Your own people are afraid of what they've learned about warfare. Emma looked up from her notes and realized that Admiral Sullivan was absolutely right. The collective races had been horrified by human military tactics, and they were still struggling. To understand how civilized beings could wage war with such ruthless efficiency. They had the knowledge now, but they lacked the psychological framework to use it effectively. Admiral Sullivan, Veltar, said with his crystal surface showing bright red patterns that Emma recognized as anger, "Are you saying that the collective is now under human protection, whether we want it or not?" Kate leaned back in her chair, and her expression became completely serious. "Ambassador, I'm saying that the galaxy has seen what human military forces can accomplish when properly motivated. Do you really think it's wise to ask us to leave when there might be other species out there who viewed our victory over the Devourers as a demonstration of what humans are capable of?" The implications of Kate's statement hit Veltar like a physical blow. By asking for human help, the collective had revealed to the entire galaxy that Earth possessed military capabilities that could destroy ancient and powerful enemies. Any species that might have been considering aggressive action against humanity would now think twice, but any species that felt threatened by human power might decide to strike first before humans became even stronger. "You're saying that by helping us, you've made yourselves targets," Veltar said quietly. "I'm saying that the strategic situation has changed for everyone," Kate replied. "The collective needs human protection because other species now know that you're allied with us. And humanity needs forward bases in your territory because we have to assume that someone out there is planning a preemptive strike against Earth." Jake felt sick as he listened to Admiral Sullivan turn the collective's request for help into justification for permanent human occupation of their space. It was brilliant strategic thinking, but it was also completely ruthless in a way that reminded him uncomfortably of how humans had fought the Devourers. Colonel Ryan Davis entered the conference room and handed Admiral Sullivan a data tablet. "Ma'am, we've completed our security assessment of collective space. I think you should see this." Kate looked at the tablet and then showed it to Veltar. The display showed a map of nearby star systems with threat assessments for each one. According to human intelligence, at least 6 different species in the whole local region possessed the technology and motivation to launch attacks against either Earth or the collective. "As you can see," Kate said, "the threat environment has become much more complex since our victory over the Devourers. Several species that were previously neutral are now showing signs of military buildup. We believe they're forming an alliance to counter human expansion." "Human expansion?" Veltar's crystal surface showed confused yellow patterns. "Admiral, Earth has never expressed any interest in territorial conquest." "Earth hasn't," Kate agreed. "But that was before we proved that human military doctrine can eliminate existential threats permanently and efficiently. The galaxy has taken notice of our capabilities, and they're responding accordingly." Emma realized that Admiral Sullivan was describing a classic security spiral. By demonstrating their overwhelming military superiority, humans had made other species feel threatened. Those species would naturally try to build defenses or form alliances to protect themselves, which would make humans feel threatened in return. A cycle would continue until someone decided that war was inevitable and launched a preemptive strike. "Admiral Sullivan," Veltar said with his voice sounding very tired, "what exactly are you proposing?" "I'm proposing that we formalize the current arrangement," Kate replied. "The collective maintains its political independence, but accepts permanent human military protection. In exchange, Earth gains the strategic depth necessary to defend against potential threats from hostile alliances. And if we refuse this arrangement? Veltar asked. Kate was quiet for a long moment before answering. Ambassador, humanity came here because you asked for our help. We've invested significant resources in defending your people, and we've made enemies in the process. I hope you understand that we can't simply abandon our strategic position in this region and leave ourselves vulnerable to attack. Jake understood what Admiral Sullivan was really saying. The human fleet wasn't going to leave collective space regardless of what the aliens wanted. They had established military bases, intelligence networks, and defensive positions that were too valuable to give up. The collective could accept human protection willingly, or they could have it imposed on them, but either way, they were going to remain under human control. I need to discuss this with the Collective Council, Veltar said finally. Of course, Kate replied with another smile that didn't reach her eyes. Take all the time you need. The human fleet will remain here to ensure your security while you deliberate. After the meeting ended, Jake found himself alone with Dr. Emma Clark in the corridor outside the conference room. Emma was staring at her notes with an expression of professional fascination mixed with personal horror. Emma, Jake said quietly, what's your psychological assessment of what just happened in there? Emma looked up at him with eyes that seemed much older than they had a few weeks ago. Jake, we didn't save the collective from the Devourers. We conquered them using their own fear as a weapon. The terrifying thing is that Admiral Sullivan probably believes she's acting in everyone's best interests. Jake nodded and looked out through a nearby window at the human construction ships that were building permanent facilities in orbit around Harmony Prime. The collective had asked for help, and humanity had given them exactly what they requested. The fact that they were now more afraid of their saviors than they had been of their enemies was simply an unfortunate side effect of human problem-solving methods.